Namaste and welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Professor Meenakshi Jain, historian and public intellectual, to discuss her latest book, Vasudev Krishna and Mathura. We all know Professor from her stellar work on Rama and Ayodhya and the flights of the deities, and also the book on the Sati and the debates surrounding the Sati during the British period. So, Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Abhinav, for having me.
Thank you, ma'am. And it's good to see you again joining the public debates and discussion after the COVID. And we are lucky to have you with us.
Thank you.
So, ma'am, this is the book you have written. It just come out very timely when Ram Mandir in Ayodhya is about to be completed in a year. And this is regarding the Mathura. Now, can you tell us, what is the relation of Vasudev Krishna with Mathura? Now, people will be surprised at this question, saying that Mathura is the city of the Krishna, is the holy city. What kind of question it is? But I'm asking from the perspective of historical, archaeological, and literary evidences.
Actually, your question is very timely because most people do not know that the first reference to Vasudev occurs in the Chandogya Upanishad. You see, till the mid-20th century, all historians, leading historians in India, like D.C. Sirkar, H.C. Ray Chaudhary, R.P. Chanda, and leading European scholars like Grierson, etc., Hopkins, they were all agreed that there was a historical figure by the name of Krishna. And the first reference to Krishna comes in the Chandogya Upanishad when they talk about Devki Putra Krishna. So the reference is very specific. After that, we have many inscriptional evidences outside Mathura. We can discuss that later. But since your question is on Mathura, I would like to begin by focusing on Mathura. Mathura, as we all know, was the ancestral home of the Vrishnis, the clan to which Vasudev belonged. And his father was the Pramukh Mukhya of the Vrishnis in Mathura. So, we all are brought up on stories of Krishna, but many of us who are not academics perhaps do not realize what is the actual evidence that we get at Mathura for the existence of a shrine in honor of Vasudev or worship of Vasudev or whatever you want to call it. So the first evidence that we get is a partial inscription of before 15 Common Era. That is more than 2200 years ago. Now, when we discuss the evidence at Mathura, we always have to keep in mind that Mathura was subjected to repeated invasions. So whatever we find is by chance. And nothing that we find is complete. So with these qualifications, I come to the first epigraphic inscription. It is called the Vasu Dor Jan. It's a small pillar, and that's only that part of it has survived. And there's an inscription also damaged. But the noted archaeologist R.P. Chanda was the first person to read this inscription. And as I told you, it's not complete. There are only bits and pieces of it. But the inscription refers to the erection of a structure. It refers to Toran, it refers to quadrangle, at which place the inscription says that I'm erecting this structure. It describes the structure. It has a Toran, it has a quadrangle, etc. But the important thing is it says I'm erecting it at the Mahasthan of Vasudev. Now this word Mahasthan has survived by chance. I should put it like that. Because when somebody is attacking or when something is being decayed, it doesn't have to, be in a uniform manner. Any part of it can be damaged, any part of it can be desecrated, or any part of it can decay. So this word Mahasthan, R.P. Chanda, who first translated this inscription, said this Mahasthan at this site means that before 15 Common Era, this site was regarded as a great place associated with Vasudev Krishna. Now, what could that association be? That association could be either it was his birthplace or the place where some important incident of his life took place, like the killing of Kans. So, some archaeologists say this is the first definitive proof of claim to that site in connection with Vasudev Krishna. So this is the first evidence that we have from Mathura.
So this is 5th BCE we are talking about, approximately.
No, 15 Common Era. 1-5 Common Era.
1-5.
Just the beginning of the... Yes.
Yeah.
So this is just the beginning of the Common Era. Then I mention another inscription. So around that time, just a little later, we have another inscription. Are you hearing my voice? So around that time, we have another inscription that is called the Mora Well inscription. That Mora Well inscription is also very interesting because, again, it's only fragments of that inscription, but it says a stone structure is being erected for the 5 Vrishni heroes. Now, the 5 Vrishni heroes is obviously Krishna, his brother, his son, Anirudh and Sambha, the 5 Vrishni heroes. So it mentions 5 Vrishni heroes and it mentions a stone structure. Again, it is around 15 Common Era. So these, see, in the academic community, this is well known. Among people who are historians of ancient India, they know this. But the point is that these things have not been brought to the public, and especially in connection with, developments that take place later. So we have the Vasu Dorjam and the Mora Well inscription. And last point I want to make in this connection. In 1911, Alexander Cunningham excavated that site. And there he found 2 male torsos and part of a female statue with an inscription at the base. Now, very senior archaeologists, very well-rated, highly reputed archaeologists, they say that it is likely that one male torso represents Vasudev and the other his brother Sankarshan. And the third is his sister. Apart from that, there are a whole series of other inscriptions that have been found there. Again, at least 8-10, which are in fragments, but which archaeologists and epigraphists have pieced together to come to some story about early history of Mathura.
But you also mentioned that Mathura has been attacked repeatedly. It has been subject to invasions after invasions. And I think the first invasion was by Mahmud of Ghaznavi.
Yes.
Right. And
yes.
he destroyed the city, and he basically, his biographies mentioned that it was a grand city and there was a temple like no other in the middle of the city. So could you please throw some light as to what happened after the invasion and how many times the Mathura was invaded and perhaps the temples were destroyed?
Yes, interesting. So as you said, the first recorded attack on Mathura is by Mahmud Ghaznavi. And there is no speculation. There is no need to speculate whether it happened or not, because his court historian, Utbi, gave a graphic account of Mahmud's activities in Mathura. So it's on record. After Mahmud Ghaznavi, we don't know what happens in Mathura because it was so badly desecrated and damaged and attacked. But about 100 years later, we get some proof or some evidence of activity in Mathura. And that is that a vassal of the Gahadwala dynasty, his partial inscription has survived. It is called the Mathura Prashasti. And in this, Jhajja is the name of that vassal. He says, I have erected a grand temple for Krishna. So, it's interesting that the story that I narrated in my book, Flight of Deities, that if a place is attacked, people don't leave that site. And as soon as they get an opportunity, they reconstruct a temple. So that story is a confirmation we have in Mathura also. The inscription has survived. Perhaps if this inscription had not survived, we would not have known of Jhajja, and we would not have known that he actually reconstructed a Krishna temple within a century of Mahmud Ghaznavi. So, again, I'm repeating, the evidence that we have is just by chance. But what we are trying to do is to prepare a connected history on the basis of these bits and pieces of evidence. So after that, this temple that Jhajja built was attacked by Qutbuddin Aibak, who was the, in the army of Muhammad Ghori. So that evidence is also there. After that, we have two Persian writers, Farishta and Abdullah. They write later, but they're obviously not writing from their imagination. They're writing from what they know and what they have researched. And they say that the temple was attacked by Firoz Tughlaq and Sikandar Lodhi. So it is possible that this Qutbuddin Aibak could not destroy the full thing, or people rebuilt it, but we don't have evidence of what happened. We have evidence of the attack of Firoz Tughlaq and Sikandar Lodhi. We don't know whether the temple of Jhajja was repaired or what. We don't know that. And the last thing that we have evidence is in the time of Akbar. In the time of Akbar, the temple seems to have been repaired substantially. Because we have a Portuguese traveler who comes to India, who comes to Akbar's court also, and he comes to Mathura. And his account is available, the translation is available, Montserrat, Father Montserrat, and he says that there are no temples in Mathura except one. And he describes this temple, which is the only standing temple, according to him, in Mathura. Again, I have to repeat that we are just trying to connect the dots on the basis of stray evidence that we have found. So and I want to say one more thing, Abhinav, that all this evidence is in the public domain. Montserrat's work has been translated into English and is available on the net also. So it's very important for people to go and look for this material themselves. Nobody should accept what I'm saying as the final word. It's all there, and all of us can access that material.
The temple was destroyed and rebuilt several times, which is
yes,
evident from the sources we have. And during the Akbar's time, it was rebuilt, and also that was the time when the Bhakti movement was becoming very strong.
Yes.
There were, if I'm not wrong, there were appeals to Shah Jahan that that the Bhakti movement is becoming so strong that the Muslims are getting attracted to it.
Yes.
The Qazis are writing letters to the Mughal emperor that stop the Muslims, they are converting to Hinduism, they are going to these temples, singing, dancing, and so on. And then you have the Islamist coup in the Mughal empire, and Aurangzeb comes to the power, and he goes, after consolidating his power, he goes straight for the destruction of the Mathura temple. What happened there, and what has been the situation since then?
So before we come to Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, there is an important development that takes place in the reign of Jahangir. You know that Jahangir, towards the end of Akbar's life, was very disillusioned with Akbar because there was a lobby in the Mughal court which was led by Raja Man Singh, advising Akbar to bypass Jahangir and appoint his son as the next Mughal emperor. That the Khusro, he was related to Mansingh. He was Mansingh's sister's son. So there was this strong lobby in the court saying that, Jahangir is not fit to be the emperor and you should make Khusro the emperor. So, and, many courtiers were working in this direction, and there was a feeling of ill will, towards Akbar, because Jahangir felt that he was being slighted. So he actually revolted and left the Mughal court and set up his rival camp. Now, at that time, when he set up his rival camp, he was not sure how things are going to turn out. And he decided that, people who are instigating his father, they should be, he should eliminate. I mean, eliminate is a strong word. He should put them in their place. And he had a grudge against Abul Fazl. Abul Fazl was then in the Deccan, and Akbar summoned him to Agra. He said, you come. So when Jahangir came to know that Abul Fazl has been summoned to Agra, he contacted this Bir Singh Bundela. Bir Singh Bundela was a prince of Orchha. He had not been made king by his father. His elder brother had been made. So he was also ambitious. So when Abul Fazl is passing through his kingdom, he has him murdered and sent the head to Jahangir. And when Jahangir became king, when he became emperor, then he made sure that Bir Singh Bundela becomes the ruler of Orchha. Now, there is no debate or conjecture possible on this incident because it was duly recorded in detail by Jahangir in the Tuzuk-e-Jahangir. He himself writes that, I told Bir Singh that I will make you king of your kingdom, but you have to eliminate Abul Fazl. So there is no, and he did make him king and gave him a high mansab, etc. Now, when Bir Singh becomes the ruler of Orchha, he builds this grand temple for Krishna. This temple, we have witness accounts of Bernier, the French physician who came to India, Bernier, and the French jeweler Tavernier. They actually went to Mathura and they saw the grand temple and they described, the massive size of the temple, the intricate work on the temple walls. And it's a very, very vivid description that it could be seen miles from away. It was such a huge temple. So this was the temple. We don't know what Shah Jahan did with this particular temple, but what you said about the other things is absolutely valid. That was absolutely correct. But I don't have any information on Shah Jahan vis-a-vis this temple. The next we hear of this temple is in 1669, when Aurangzeb gives orders for the destruction of all temples, and in 1670 specifically of this temple of Bir Singh Bundela.
So what led Aurangzeb to destroy this temple and build that Eidgah mosque, the mosque which still stands in Mathura? Why exactly Aurangzeb antagonized Hindus when the social contract between the Mughals and the Hindus was running more or less because, Hindus had this subordinate position, but the empire was consolidated and you had lots of Hindu nobility as the part of the Mughal empire. So why did Aurangzeb did what he did?
See, as far as the nobility is concerned, I'll just make a few very brief points. When you actually look at the figures of the Hindu representation in the Mughal nobility, it's really nothing to boast about. Just give you the example of Akbar, who's regarded rightly so as, the most liberal and the most broad-minded of the Mughal emperors. 70% of his nobility consisted of foreigners, that is, Iranis and Turanis. And it is only when they went on revolting against him that he decided that he must have all the weight is on one side, so the scale must have something on the other side also. And that is when he decided that he has to bring in people who will be loyal to him. And he chose very wisely two communities. One was the Rajputs, because they were the sword arm of society. They were the warriors, they would help him. And the other were the Indian Muslims, who would not think of upstaging him or dethroning him. And that limited representation continued in the time of his successors, that is Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Non-Persian and Turki representation was modest at all these times. In the reign of Aurangzeb, the situation changed slightly for two reasons. One was that the number of foreigners coming from outside was not as large because of developments in those countries. And the second was developments in the Deccan, which occupied Aurangzeb for 25 years of his reign. Now, whatever a certain class of historians may say or may do to whitewash the image of Aurangzeb, actually the facts cannot be wished away. And, before destroying the temple, Aurangzeb's farmans that Holi and Diwali, for example, will not be celebrated. Now, as far as this temple is concerned, Dara Shikoh had gifted a stone railing because the wooden railing of the temple had decayed. So there were many reasons for him. He was a complex character, but I think it will be stretching things too far if we regard him as a friend of the Hindu community. I think it will be really stretching things too far. So in 1669, he gave a general order for the destruction of temples, and in 1670, specifically of the Keshav Dev temple.
Since then, what has been the situation? The Hindus must have tried to reclaim and rebuild the temple. And we know that the dispute is still unresolved. There are court cases as well. So could you explain the evolution of the contestation between the Hindus and the Muslims after Aurangzeb destroyed the Krishna temple in Mathura?
Now, Aurangzeb died in 1707. The next attack on Mathura was the most lethal, I think. It was by Ahmad Shah Abdali. And again, we have a person who was a camp follower of Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was there when Ahmad Shah Abdali attacked Agra and Mathura. And he has left a vivid eyewitness account. And that eyewitness account, which was written in Persian, has been translated by Irwin, and I have reproduced parts of that account in my book. And the Ghulam Hussain Samin is his name. And he said, and it's a very long description, but just to put it in brief, he says that, Ahmad Shah Abdali, he attacked Mathura, and he's given a very gory description. And 5 rupees per head of an infidel was offered to his soldiers. And, at the end of the day, the soldiers would come with the heads, and he's described that scene, and it is really very, very painful. So this is the last account that we have of what is happening in Mathura after the death of Aurangzeb. Then the picture becomes clear in 1770. In 1770, the Marathas win the Battle of Govardhan, and they become the dominant power in Mathura and Agra. And when they become the dominant power in Mathura and Agra, they declare Katra Keshav Dev as Nazul, or government land. And the people who are in the Eidgah, they leave the Eidgah because they say, now there is no need for us to stay here. There's nothing for us to do here. We will go elsewhere and look for our livelihood elsewhere. So the fact of the Eidgah representatives leaving that place is on record. After that, the next account that we have is in 1803, when the East India Company replaces the Marathas in this area. And they also declare Katra Keshav Dev as Nazul, or government land. The next evidence, or the next bit of information that we have, is in 1815, the East India Company sells the entire Katra Keshav Dev to Raja Patnimal of Banaras. Katra Keshav Dev means 13.37 acres. And I want to emphasize again and again that this sale to Raja Patnimal by the East India Company was recorded in the British Judicial and Revenue Records, which have survived. And after Raja Patnimal, his successors are duly entered as owners of Katra Keshav Dev. Again, at no point is the family shown as not possessing the entire Katra Keshav Dev. 13.37 acres is never divided with anyone else. It's always in the family of Raja Patnimal. So, shall I continue?
But what happened to the mosque there when the land is sold back to the Hindu king, to the Hindu king of Banaras? What happened to the Eidgah Mosque and the Krishna Janmabhoomi Mandir?
Now I just have to explain that it was sold to Raja Patnimal in 1815. All right. We have a lot of reports on the ground by F.S. Grouse, who wrote the Mathura Gazetteer. And we have Alexander Cunningham, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, who made many trips to Mathura. So Alexander Cunningham's reports I have cited in my book, and I've also quoted from F.S. Grouse, the Mathura Gazetteer, because it contains a lot of information on the destruction of the mandir and subsequently. Now, Cunningham, he makes a couple of visits to Mathura, and he says that this charge that Aurangzeb destroyed the temple, he says that the inscriptions of the temple have been broken into pieces and used as pavement. And he says that one of the inscriptions talks about a visit of a pilgrim in a particular year to this temple. Like people go and engrave on I visited this place. Even today, people do that. So Cunningham writes that this temple, these are the dimensions. He gives the dimensions to the temple because he's an archaeologist. His work is to, survey the area. And he says it is very clear that it was one of the biggest temples in India. And then he says that the Eidgah is now just a dilapidated structure. This is the last account that we have of Cunningham. It's a dilapidated structure in a corner. And in fact, he says excavation should be done in that area because in any case, nobody is coming there. It's a dilapidated structure. So this is the reports of Cunningham. You see, we have to remember that Grouse, Cunningham, and all these people, they never thought that their reports are going to be used as testimony one way or another a century later. So they wrote what they saw, and they were not trying to influence events 100 years later. So in any case, the thing is sold to Raja Patnimal and his heirs. And from 1815 onwards, what happens, I'm just telling you, from 1815 onwards, suddenly people representing the Eidgah, they start filing cases in the Mathura courts, saying that we don't recognize Patnimal, he's not the owner, why is he trying to claim he's the owner, etc. So there are a series of cases, I've quoted them entirely in my book, beginning from 1815. The British judicial officers, they hear this case, a succession of officers hears this case, and each officer, judicial officer, dismisses the case. And they give extensive, elaborate reasons why they're dismissing the case. They say the tenants in that area are paying the rent to Patnimal's heirs. When the Vrindavan railway line was constructed there, a part of the land was surrendered by Patnimal's family. The compensation for that was paid to Raja Patnimal by the British Railway Authority. So they give a whole lot of evidence. And the most disturbing thing is that they say you're trying to forge documents. They tell the Idgah party that you're trying to forge documents. So they show that, you are saying that this place its name was Katra Idgah. So they say you have not been able to produce any document of any period which refers to this place as Katra Idgah. It is always referred to as Katra Keshav Dev. Then, they say that you're referring to Krishna Chabutra as Tehkhana, but there is no document that you have prepared or presented. So, it's a very elaborate, each judge does not dismiss it without giving his reasons and tracing the genesis of this whole dispute. So it is I think the documents, I'm not produced the whole thing, they must be running into more than 100 pages of judgments by the British officials. And when these people go on persisting, one judge says that you're behaving like a hardened litigant, and you're just going on and on and on where you have no claim whatever. Tell us one document that you have been able to produce which substantiates your claim in any way. So all the judgments in the British period went in favor of Raja Patnimal and his successors. Abhinav, I want to emphasize the point that the entire plot goes to Raja Patnimal and his family. It is not that one piece went to somebody else. The entire plot went to Raja Patnimal. Then you can ask me what happens after independence.
So what happened after independence? Because you see the British court is dismissing the plea. But what happened to that structure, that mosque there? Because, the land is now owned by Raja Patnimal and his successors. The Idgah committee members are trying to forge documents and file cases, which is being dismissed by the British government. But why was the mosque still standing there? Or was it built later on or maybe repaired? As you said, it was a dilapidated structure. So was it repaired in the subsequent decades? And what happened after independence?
This is the crux of the whole problem. Because the last eyewitness account is of Cunningham, who says it's a dilapidated structure. But the structure that we see today is not dilapidated by any chance. So what happens? In 1944, Raja Patnimal's heirs sell this whole plot to Jugal Kishore Birla. And in 1951, Jugal Kishore Birla creates a trust, Shri Krishna Janambhoomi Trust. This trust, and he gives the entire land, 13.37 acres, to this trust, which consists of people like Madan Mohan Malviya. And the trust the terms of that trust are available. And that trust has only one objective, and that is to create a grand temple for Krishna. So this till 1951, when Jugal Kishore Birla creates this trust, headed by Madan Mohan Malviya, the picture is very clear. Now, after that, there is quite a bit of confusion. Because what happens is that in 1968, another body comes to the fore. It may have been there before, but we have no, there's no entity. It's not referred to in any documents or anything. So this is called Shri Krishna Janamsthan Seva Sangh. Now this Seva Sangh has no judicial power because the power to decide the fate of Katra Keshav Dev is given to that trust which Jugal Kishore Birla set up. And that trust was entitled to construct a temple. That trust never said you can divide this land. So in 1968, this body comes, Seva Sangh. And you'll be absolutely shocked to know that it enters into an agreement with the Idgah party and gives 3 acres of Katra Keshav Dev to them.
How exactly? Yeah. How exactly?
Now,
With what legal authority?
Now, the point is that somebody challenged it in court, and 2 court judgments came, and they said we don't recognize any entity called Seva Sangh because there is no judicial. If you're a trust, you have to have judicial papers to back your claim.
Yep.
We only recognize Janam Bhoomi Trust created by Jugal Kishore Birla. There is no evidence that you have been able to produce which shows that you have the right to decide on the fate of this land. So 2 court judgments of Mathura said, we do not recognize Seva Sangh as the trustee. For us, the trustee is the trust created, that is the Janam Bhoomi Trust, Krishna Janam Bhoomi Trust. But the thing is that in 1968, who authorized the sale of the gifting of 3 acres of land to a plot which was always a whole? That's why I went on saying Krishna, Katra Keshav Dev was never divided. It was always one whole. It was sold as one whole. The trust also got it as one whole. And the Jugal Kishore Birla got it as one whole, and the trust got it as one whole. Now, a body which has no legal sanctity, how did it surrender 3 acres of land to the Eidgah party? So, this is a question which the Seva Sangh has never answered. And actually, to be very fair, nobody knew about this agreement till 1993. This is another puzzle. Can you imagine a secret deal was done? 3 acres of land of Katra Keshav Dev was supposed to be transferred and was transferred to the Eidgah party, but nobody knew about it. What happened is that in 1993, after the Babri Masjid demolition, namaz began to be offered every day at Mathura. So somebody filed a case in the Mathura court that till now namaz used to be offered only twice a year. So now why is it being offered every day? That is when the UP government came and said there is an agreement of 1968.
So basically it's a false document by the secular Hindus?
We don't know. I cannot answer anything on this because I don't know.
Yeah.
First of all, what was the compulsion? Was there some political compulsion on the Seva Sangh? We have no answers.
Who are the members of the Seva Sangh? Who are these people?
See, the list is given in the case that Vishnu Jain has filed in the Mathura court. So he's produced a lot of documents. I thought, let him argue it. It's not fair for me to reproduce those documents. But among the people he mentions are 2 Congress men. One is D.P. Mishra, who was then the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh. And the other is M.A.A. Iyengar, who was then the governor of Bihar, but who had been, member of parliament and all from the Congress party before. He has given the list, the composition of that Seva Sangh. And, so now the thing is that it's very difficult to comprehend why the Mandir party had to give 3 acres of land to the Eidgah party when the entire land.
But the point is that they were not the Mandir party to begin with. It seems to me that after what happened in Ayodhya, these people forced a document in retrospect and claimed that the land was given to the Eidgah mosque to run a mosque or something, something like that. I think all the indications are towards a case of forgery to protect the idea of India. Am I right?
I can't say right now because the UP government in 1993 told the court that there was an agreement in 1968 between Seva Sangh and the Eidgah, and the Seva Sangh gave. So this is a statement that the government of Uttar Pradesh made in court, gave the exact date on which the agreement was signed. So it seems to be wheels within wheels, and it's very difficult. And I cannot understand the compulsion. What was the compulsion when every court judgment had gone in favor of the Katra Keshav Dev group? And Katra Keshav Dev was always sold as one unit. And the Eidgah party had won no case ever. So obviously from what I can make out, the full details are still not available to us.
Mm.
And I think that if and when the court begins the hearings, many things will come out. My purpose in writing this book was that, it's by chance that Vishnu Jain filed the case in September 2020. My book was ready at that time. Then I was hospitalized because of COVID. And when I came back, I found that he had filed a case. So I added the last 10 pages on the basis of what his complaint in the court is. Otherwise, my story was going to end with the creation of the Krishan Janambhoomi Trust by Jugal Kishore Birla. I did not know about the agreement of 1968 until I read the case. Not many people knew about it. So, it is one of those things. On the one hand, we have Jhajjar rebuilding the temple 1 century after Mahmud Ghaznavi. And on the other, we have Seva Sangh giving temple land to the Eidgah party. So,
a shadowy organization signing some deal, claiming to be representative of the Hindus, and when no one even knows about it. But what is the situation now since 1993 to 2021? Now we have this demand coming up again and again for the reclamation and reconstruction of the Krishan Janambhoomi Mandir in Mathura. Is the mosque there protected, or the structure, Eidgah mosque, there protected by any law as of now, or is just an encroachment on the sacred land?
See, now the question is, what did the Eidgah do with that 3 acres? Is the present Eidgah built on those 3 acres? Is there any evidence that they have that it is existing before 1968? Because we have the report of Cunningham saying that it was a dilapidated structure. The structure today is not dilapidated. Now, Vishnu Jain and others are saying that the present Eidgah is constructed after 1968. And they say because it is constructed after 1968, the People's Worship Act of 1991 does not apply to it. So, these are questions which we have to wait for the answers and for the court to decide. At this moment, this is all one can say, because the question remains, what happened to, where is that 3 acres?
Yeah.
Is the masjid built on 3 acres?
Yeah.
If it is built on 3 acres, yes.
Yeah, very interesting point, Professor. I think what you have told us today, I think most of us, including me, did not know about it. I'm yet to read the entire book. I just read initial parts. But thank you for writing this wonderful book. And I would urge everyone in the audience to read this book, buy this book, and gift this book as well to the people to spread awareness about the actual status. Because very soon we will have these articles in The Wire, The Quint, and whatnot, claiming, that Seva Sangh represents Hindus and this was an agreement signed between the 2 parties. And now these people are trying to, create disturbance and trouble over the Krishan Janambhoomi Mandir. But thanks a lot, Professor, for your time, for talking to us. Hoping to invite you soon to discuss more things and other topics.
Thank you so much, Abhinav, for having me. Thank you so much.
And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Please subscribe to the channel and join us the channel to support the channel. Hoping to see you soon. Thank you once again.
Thank you.